The night Karen Ellis called and asked me to come over for dinner, I almost said no, because some invitations sound simple right up until the moment they aren't. My name is Nathan Cole. I'm 33, I fix commercial HVAC systems for a living, and until that phone call, I hadn't sat at Karen's kitchen table in almost 15 years. Karen was my best friend's mother growing up. Back then, her house was the place where half the neighborhood ended up after school, eating cereal out of mismatched bowls and tracking mud through her hallway while she pretended not to notice. Her son, Danny, was the friend I grew up with, the one I built tree houses with, snuck out with, and eventually drifted from the way people drift from their childhoods without ever meaning to. Danny had moved out west years back. We still talked, but it had thinned down to birthday texts and the occasional meme. Karen and I hadn't spoken much since his wedding, which felt like a different lifetime. So when her name lit up my phone on a Tuesday evening, my first thought wasn't excitement. It was worry. People your mother's age don't usually call out of nowhere unless something's wrong. Nathan, she said, and her voice had that same warmth I remembered, low and unhurried, like she had all the time in the world just for you. I know this is out of nowhere. Everything okay? I asked. She laughed, soft and a little embarrassed. Everything's fine. I was cleaning out the garage and found a box of old photos. You and Danny building that ridiculous fort. It made me think I hadn't seen your face in person in years. So I'm asking. Come for dinner Friday. Nothing complicated. Just food and old stories. I should have had a good reason to say no. I didn't. So I said yes, and I told myself it was exactly what it sounded like, an old family friend wanting company, nothing more complicated than that. Friday came slower than it should have. I picked up a bottle of wine because that felt like the adult thing to do, then second-guessed it in the car like a teenager worried about making a bad impression. Karen's house looked the same from the outside, pale blue siding, a porch swing that had probably been replaced twice but somehow still looked identical to the one from my memory. When she opened the door, I almost said something dumb like, "You haven't aged a day," except it was actually true enough that saying it felt dangerous. She wore a soft green sweater, hair down instead of the practical ponytail I remembered from decades of school pickups, and she smiled at me like she'd been looking forward to this longer than one phone call would explain. "Look at you," she said, stepping back to let me in. "All grown up and still terrible at picking wine, I bet." I stood in that aisle for 10 minutes, I admitted. "It shows," she said, but she was already smiling wider, and something about the ease of it made the awkwardness melt out of my shoulders before I even got my coat off. The house smelled like garlic and something roasting, and for a second I was 17 again, dropping my backpack by the door and asking if dinner was almost ready. She led me into the kitchen, and there it was, the same round table, a fresh tablecloth, 2 place settings instead of the crowd of them I remembered from childhood chaos. Just 2. That detail sat quietly in the back of my mind and refused to leave. We ate slowly. She'd made a roast chicken, the kind of meal that takes real effort, not something you throw together for an old family friend on a random Friday. She asked about my work, my apartment, whether I was seeing anyone. I told her the honest answer, which was no, not really, not for a while. She nodded like that didn't surprise her, which struck me as an odd thing to not be surprised by. "You were always careful with people," she said. "Even as a kid. You'd rather wait and get it right than rush into the wrong thing." "That sounds like a nice way of calling me slow," I said. She laughed, and the sound filled the kitchen in a way that made the whole room feel warmer. "It's not slow. It's rare. Most people your age just want the next thing. You actually pay attention." I didn't know what to do with a compliment like that from her, so I changed the subject and asked about Danny. Her face shifted, just slightly, fond but distant. "He's good. Busy. He calls when he remembers, which isn't often enough, but that's how it goes when children build their own lives." She said it without bitterness, just a quiet kind of acceptance that made me feel, for a second, like I'd been paying more attention to her than her own son had lately. After dinner, she poured 2 glasses of wine I hadn't asked for and set them on the small table by the window instead of clearing straight to dessert. That felt like an invitation to stay longer, so I did. "Can I ask you something?" she said, turning her glass slowly by the stem, "and you don't have to answer if it's strange." "Go ahead." Do you remember the summer you were 15? The one where you broke your wrist falling off the shed roof trying to fix Danny's antenna? I laughed. I remember the cast more than the fall. I remember sitting up with you until your parents got back from their trip, she said. You were in so much pain, but you kept apologizing for being a bother. 15 years old, and you were more worried about inconveniencing me than about your own arm. She looked down at her glass. I thought about that a lot over the years. How careful you were with other people's comfort, even when you were the one hurting. Something in her voice had changed, gone quieter, more deliberate, like she was walking toward something she'd rehearsed and wasn't sure she still had the nerve for. Karen, I said carefully, why did you really ask me to dinner tonight? She was quiet long enough that the refrigerator hum in the background became noticeable. Then she set her glass down and looked at me directly, the way people look at you when they've decided honesty matters more than comfort. Because I've thought about you more than I should have for longer than I want to admit, she said. And I'm tired of pretending that box of photos was the reason I called. The kitchen went very still. I felt my pulse pick up in a way that had nothing to do with the wine. I don't mean that the way it probably sounds, she added quickly, some of her composure slipping. Or maybe I do. I don't know anymore. You were a boy in my house for years, Nathan. I watched you grow into someone steady and kind in a way that most men never manage. And somewhere along the way, watching you stopped feeling like watching my son's friend. I didn't say anything right away, because I didn't trust what would come out if I opened my mouth too fast. I'm not asking you to feel anything, she went on, her voice steadier now that the hardest part was out. I just couldn't keep having a nice, easy dinner and pretending there wasn't a reason underneath it. That felt dishonest. And I didn't want to be dishonest with you. Not you, of all people. How long? I finally asked because it was the only question that mattered. She exhaled, like she'd been holding that answer for years and finally got permission to set it down. Longer than is appropriate for me to admit out loud. Long enough that I told myself it would pass. It didn't. I sat with that for a moment, turning my glass the way she had hers, buying myself time I didn't really need, because somewhere under the shock, I realized I wasn't as surprised as I should have been. I'd noticed things too. The way this dinner had felt different from the family gatherings of my memory. The way she dressed for it. The two place settings instead of a crowd. I'd noticed and told myself not to. I should probably say something reassuring, I said slowly, about how that's not something I've thought about. But I'd be lying, and you just told me you didn't want to be dishonest with me. I don't think I want to start being dishonest with you either. Her eyes lifted to mine, cautious and hopeful in a way that made her look younger than I'd ever seen her. I noticed this felt different tonight, I admitted. I told myself it was just nostalgia. Maybe it wasn't only that. Nathan, she said quietly, I need you to be sure before you say anything else. I am not a lonely woman using her son's old friend to feel less alone. If that's what this becomes, I'd rather you leave now and we go back to birthday texts and pretending this dinner never happened. That's not what this is, I said, and I meant it more certainly than I expected to. I think I've spent years assuming the way I felt around you was just respect. Maybe it always was more than that, and I never let myself look at it directly because you were Danny's mother and that felt like a door I wasn't allowed to open. And now, she asked. Now I'm sitting at your table and I don't want to leave, I said. That has to mean something. She reached across the table then, not grabbing, just resting her fingers near mine, close enough that the choice was mine to make. I covered her hand with mine, and the kitchen felt smaller and warmer all at once, the way a room does when two people finally stop pretending about something. This is going to be complicated, she said softly. I know. Danny is going to have opinions. I know that too. She almost smiled. You're taking this remarkably calmly for a man who just found out his childhood best friend's mother has feelings for him. I've had 15 years of practice not panicking about things I didn't understand, I said. Feels like the same skill. That got a real laugh out of her, the kind that broke some of the tension sitting in the room, and for a moment it felt like we were just two people at a table again, except everything underneath had shifted. Danny found out 2 weeks later, and it went about as badly as we expected. He called me first, voice tight and confused, asking if it was some kind of joke. I told him the truth, plainly, because Karen and I had agreed early on that hiding it would only make it uglier later. He didn't yell. He just went quiet in a way that felt worse than yelling would have, and then he said he needed time and hung up. Karen took that harder than she let on. She sat on her porch swing that evening, arms wrapped around herself even though it wasn't cold, and told me she'd known this was the cost going in. "I'm not asking him to be happy about it," she said. "I'm asking him to eventually let it be true without deciding it makes me a fool." It took Danny nearly 2 months to call again. When he did, his voice was careful, not warm exactly, but no longer closed off either. "I still think it's weird," he said. "I don't think I'll ever fully stop thinking that. But Mom sounds happier than I've heard her in years. And you were always good to her, even before any of this. I guess I can live with weird if it means she's not lonely anymore." That was as close to a blessing as either of us were going to get, and it was enough. We took our time after that. No rushing, no performing for anyone who wanted a tidy explanation. Karen kept planting things in her garden and calling them practical instead of symbolic, and I kept showing up for dinner on Fridays until Fridays quietly turned into every day. A year later, I moved my things into the house I used to track mud through as a teenager, and it didn't feel strange the way I thought it might. It felt like the room had finally caught up to something that had been true for longer than either of us admitted. Danny came to visit last spring. He sat at that same round table, looked between his mother and me, and shook his head slowly. "I still can't believe this is my life now," he said. "Get used to it," Karen told him, refilling his glass without asking. "This is going to be your life for a very long time." He laughed, and it was easy this time, no edge left in it. People still ask sometimes how we ended up together, and Karen usually tells them she invited an old family friend to dinner and got honest with him before she lost her nerve. I tell them I almost said no to that dinner, and it would have been the biggest mistake of my life. So, have you ever had someone from your past turn out to be exactly the person you needed, once you finally let yourself see them clearly? And would you have had the courage to stay at that table once you knew the real reason for the invitation? Tell me in the comments. If you like this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.